This past week at the clergy Bible study I attend, we all said the same thing about this week's gospel reading. It's a hard one to explain, just as is our reading from Haggai and 2 Thessalonians. We jokingly said, one way to get around this difficult problem is that we would all preach on something other than the scriptures this week. The topics we then went to banter around, we finally decided would probably cause us more trouble and render us a phone call from the bishop than if we just stick with the lessons. So we did what anyone else would do in a situation like that. We changed the subject. And we began to figure out how we might help solve all the world's problems. We left that day hoping that sometime during the next week, God would find in his mercy to drop a simple answer in our lap that we could then share with our congregation. I don't know about the others, but when I sat down to write and I looked in my lap, it was empty. It was as if God was saying, just deal with it. It's not the first time God has told me that. When difficult times and situations or tasks are before me, especially those that I just don't think I can get around, I sometimes feel God is just saying, deal with it. Maybe some of you have felt that way too. The good news is that in those times that feel so trying, even overwhelming, I knew I didn't have to deal with them alone, but with the blessings and help of God. But if the truth be known, knowing this didn't make all those things all that much easier. Times and things were still difficult. My frustrations and feelings of despair did not go away. The way I felt was compressed, pushed down. But in the end, I knew things would be okay. Things would work themselves out. Maybe not as I envisioned, but as God did. And even though part of me had trouble accepting this, there's part of me that said, okay, Lord, let's do this. I suspect I'm not the only one here who's had that kind of struggle. And as I freely admit, I still try very hard at times to take things on by myself. Feeling at times my over-reliance on God is a sign of weakness. And I think there are some here today who would probably feel the same way or have felt that way at one time in their lives. Instead of enlisting God's help, we tend to then push it away, seeing it as an interference in our lives. And if we can do that in the tough times, think how easy it is to do it in the good. You know those good times, times when we think everything's going along so smoothly, or at least as smoothly as it can. And we get upset when someone comes along in those times and says us there's a coming storm, upsetting the apple cart, rocking the boat, so to speak. And when we're confronted by someone like that, the first thing we tend to do is dismiss them as misguided. Maybe even just a little bit crazy. And when that does not silence the voice we hear, we strive to discredit them, showing those around us and around them just how little they really know. That is what the Sadducees are trying to do to Jesus in today's gospel. One who, like the prophets of the Old Testament, seems to have come along to warn of a coming storm that they do not see. And how do we know that's what they're trying to do? They confront Jesus with an almost impossible scenario. A woman, because of Jewish tradition, is forced to marry 6 brothers of her husband, dies. And in this kingdom Jesus is talking about, The Sadducees want to know, whose wife will she be? And what makes this confrontation so ironic is that the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. That's why they're sad, you see.
Very good. Very good.
Also, unlike the Pharisees, who were much more legalistic, the Sadducees were more often than not willing to compromise with the secular world, trying to find a balance between the demands of God and those of the reigning political or military power. As one might expect, seeing the world so differently put the Pharisees and Sadducees at odds with one another, except in one regard: their dislike for the message of Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was rocking their boat. Those in religious power, the Pharisees, saw Jesus as a threat to their status as the champions of faith. And the Sadducees, they believed that if Jesus kept talking about this emerging kingdom, it would threaten the stability Israel had with Rome, thereby bringing down further wrath from an already distrustful and oppressive occupier. Problem was, Jesus had become so popular, they couldn't just dismiss him. And even though his message of God's kingdom seems sometimes to be a little bit out there, the miracles he performed as a witness to the power of that kingdom were not seen by the people as the work of a crazy man, but as the work of a man of God. So the Pharisees and Sadducees did the only thing they could. They sought to discredit him. And we hear it over and over throughout the scriptures. For the Sadducees, they saw this opportunity in today's gospel as a win-win situation. Discredit Jesus on the issue of the resurrection, and not only do they take him down a notch, they gain a leg up on the Pharisees by discrediting what the Sadducees felt was a misguided belief in the resurrection. This is a train that Jesus sees coming. And just as he always does, he turns it around and pushes them right back at him, saying that life following the resurrection is this life in the coming kingdom, this life in heaven, is not going to be anything like life in this world. We will not be guided by human emotion, pride, or greed. No one will be subservient to another. No one will be owned by another. And the traditions of man will be without merit. All, the rich and the poor, the men and the women, all would be seen as equals in the eyes of God, and therefore will be loved by God as one of God's own. He goes on to say, if that weren't true, then Moses told a big one. Because Moses said that God was the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus is pulling out all the stops. And in doing so, shows that it is the Sadducees who have it all wrong. The resurrection is real. Life following the resurrection will be nothing like that implied in their impossible scenario. It will not be tarnished by sin as life in this world is. It will be a life of grace and love. And not just for a time, like we live on this earth, but for all of eternity. Now I know there are some out there who hear this reading and jump to the conclusion that those who are married in this life will somehow not be married in the next. That's not what Jesus is saying. In the story of Israel, we learn that we, humanity, were given marriage to provide us with a companion who would be there to share our struggles and our joys. Because God created us to be in relationships. Relationship with God and with one another. Besides, we read in Scripture that not everyone is given to a life of solitude, or even celibacy for that matter. All Jesus is saying is that life after the resurrection is not about our relationship with one another, but our relationship with God. The bonds of marriage are usurped by the bonds of God's love. Love that permeates our very being, so much so that we will no longer seek that love through marriage, but seek that love through our shared being with God. Therefore, love that exists in this world, especially that love between man and woman, husband and wife, companion and companion, that love has to exist in the next world because love is love, if it is the love of God. How do we know that the love we experience in and through one another is actually the love of God? Well, Paul answers that for us back in his first letter to the Corinthians when he says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not rude or self-seeking. It does not delight in evil. But it protects, trusts, hopes, and perseveres. Agape, God's love, never fails. It lasts in eternity. Now, knowing this may not make things we face all that much easier. Times and things may still be difficult to endure. Our frustrations and our feelings of anxiety and despair may never go away. Still, in the end, God's love reminds us that all things will be okay. Things will eventually work themselves out. Maybe not as we envision in this life, but as God has envisioned from the very beginning. And even though part of us has trouble accepting this, there is a part of us willing to say, okay, Lord, let's do this.